Welcome to Human Histories.
God bless you all. God save the King.
December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
With you it rests, Callimachus, either to bring Athens to slavery, or, by securing her freedom, to be remembered by all future generations. For never since the time that the Athenians became a people were they in so great a danger as now. If they bow their necks beneath the yoke of the Persians, the woes which they will have to suffer are already determined. If, on the other hand, they fight and overcome, Athens may rise to be the very first city in Greece. Miltiades in Herodotus Histories. Hey everybody, welcome to Human Histories. I'm Ashton Myers, joined by my co-host, as always, Riley Osborne. Take it away, brother.
I'm just going to briefly touch on how to support the podcast. I'm going to try to keep it as brief as possible this time. Just go to the humanhistoriespodcast.com. From there, you can buy the books that we use as sources, and then we'll get some support from affiliate links through that. You can follow us on Instagram through that website. You can donate through that website. Most importantly, you can ask us questions or just give us information that we missed on the show. We love extra information. We love getting some good tips.
We love being told we're wrong, because then you can get better.
Absolutely. And most importantly, hit the follow button. And if you would so please, for $0, just give us a nice 5-star rating, because that actually helps a lot as well. So thanks a lot, guys.
All right, so a brief recap for those of you who may not have listened to our previous episode, and if you didn't, well, maybe you should go do that right now, give you a better idea of what's going on in this episode. But anyway, let's get into it. So the Ionian Revolution, which was an attempt by the Greeks to attain sovereignty over themselves, had failed. It had begun in 499 BC and ended in 494 BC. And worthy of note, this is something important that I want to mention, that this was early Greece, right? 490, this was early Greece. And at this point, the Greeks were not an entity in and of themselves as we knew them later on. They were more just a group, like different tribes and groups of people who all resided within the same geographic region, who shared some traits, but also had many idiosyncrasies amongst themselves, which is to say unique characteristics. So it wouldn't be until 478 AD that the Greeks became a homogeneous entity. So keep that in mind when we're going through this as we talk about how, maybe Athens needs help from Sparta or Sparta needs help from Plataea. They're not all buddy-buddy. They're not all a unit at this point. Anyhow, in 492, Mardonius, the son-in-law of Darius, had resubjugated Thrace and Macedonia. The latter, having previously been a vassal, was now annexed entirely, becoming a part of the Persian Empire. This campaign into Greece by the Persians in 492 was cut short by inclement weather, you could say. A fleet of ships sunk, 20,000 Persians dead. And so now they stalled. They came back in 490. The Athenians knew they were coming, and having been out of the fight for 8 years, they were aware that Darius had not forgot about them. Before he would reach them, however, the Persians would offer one last chance at clemency. They had sent emissaries to both Athens and Sparta. Both of those delegations would be executed, solidifying the enmity Persia held for Greece. The die was cast, and they would meet at Marathon.
So the year is 490 BC, and Darius is beginning his final expedition into Greece. All those years of being told, "Remember the Athenians," by his slaves were finally about to pay off. But first, he'd have to assemble a navy, and with it, a plan. So just to touch on, the same as last week's episodes, we're going to be using a lot of Herodotus. He's the best sort of idea of the time that we have. A lot of his writings are a bit dramatic, and we're going to try to, over the next couple of minutes here, we're going to try to sort of make them more
plausible
within the scope of reality. Exactly, right? So, he put numbers that are kind of insane, but what we do know is that they most likely set sail with a total of about 600 ships, and likely 300 triremes, and then another 300 transport ships.
And you might be asking, what is a trireme, and how many men can one carry? Well, a trireme was an ancient galley. A galley was a ship with a sail and oars, and the trireme had 3 rows of oars, three. So it was the dominant ship type in the Mediterranean at this time, created in the 7th century BC by the Corinthians. Not just for transport, triremes were also utilized as a military vessel via a ram. So they would just cut ships in half, right? The infantry aboard were often the oarsmen. For the Greeks, especially, though if you're the Persians, you have people for that, right? And a standard trireme had 85 oars per side, so a total of 170. They had the potential to cover vast distances in a day, and while most crews could average 100 to 150 kilometers, Thucydides reported an experienced crew having traveled 300 kilometers in a day. And this is immense for the ancient world, man. The ancient world ran on you know how it is, man. It's like postal, right? It's like, hey, let me get on my horse and bring this letter to you 300 kilometers away. I'll be there in a week, right? So now having this technology in the Mediterranean Sea and being able to go those vast distances. I want to take a second and kind of banter with you, Riley, about it, because when you think of it, think of the Romans, and think of maybe even the Huns. They had their horses, right? But think of that vast difference in warfare and just cultural significance of being near the sea that the Greeks had, right? With this ability to have such not only quick transport, but transport of so much material or men or what have you.
I think it's important because even last week when we were talking about the Ionian revolt, even now in the Aegean, there's multiple Greek cities, not we're talking about, these are Greek city-states, but they're throughout the Aegean Sea, and they're totally islands. They're quote-unquote isolated from anywhere else. It's not like they have a bridge to a different area. So the Greeks are actually probably pretty good at seafaring. And the other crazy part is, in last week's episode, we touched on how the distance between the most west point of the Persian Empire and Greece is about 400 kilometers. So judging by let's say the Persians had just an average crew for most of their triremes, this is still at most a 5 to 6 day trip, which even in today's standards, that's not a very long amount of time. The Persians are really right at the Greeks' doorstep here. So I think that it's definitely a myth that the Persians are super far away, or that it's impossible for them to get to Greece. I really think it's quite obvious that this little plot of sea in the Aegean, it's like a moat in comparison to, let's say the Atlantic or the Pacific. It's not some massive achievement for the Persians to cross this body of water. They're right there. They're just waiting for the right time, and sure, that little body of water saved them once with, that Persian fleet sinking, but how long is that going to last, right? And it doesn't last, because right now the Persians, they've got 600 ships and they're on their way.
I find it so interesting too, right? Because I think that I think if you're a listener and you had no idea of the geographic scope of how close and compacted all these people actually were, you're not alone, because I was in the same boat as you 2 weeks ago. Same boat as you 2 weeks ago, before I started really, really deep diving and looking into this stuff. And I'm sure Riley is as well. We both had the misconception that Persia was just this mean conqueror that just wanted to bully people, and it was super far away. And now we're oh wait, hold up, these guys were right next door, and they were actually pretty cool dudes half the time, right?
Honestly, even when we dive into this further, when we talk about Eritrea and stuff like that, these places are quite close in proximity, unbelievably close, And then even when we look at what we're going to get into, which is the Battle of Marathon, to show you just how unbelievably close to Athens this combat will take place. It's all so incredible. So to dive back in, now that we know that it's probably a decent assumption that the Persians have between 300 and 600 ships, most likely closer to 600. Now, the estimates for the number of Persians during the invasion, they vary from as little as 18,000, and then they get to as great as 600,000. But this is a result of our historical facts being, post facto, right? So this is after the events are taking place. Sometimes hundreds or thousands of years later, these things are written. So especially ancient historians love hyperbole, and that's something that we sort of try to bring back down to realism, because with this one number, 600,000, unless the Persians had 1,000 guys on every boat, that's not a realistic number. And I'm just to break it down, they did not have 1,000 people on every boat. That would be completely impossible. That's like a bunch of, imagine they just got 600 cruise ships sailing across the Aegean in 500 BC. It's not happening, right? So, Ashton, you sort of did the math on how, and I know you love math, so you did the math on how many guys can hop into these ships. So give us our best estimate on the amount of guys the Persians would have had.
Okay, so first, the Persians, as I said earlier, they had people to row, right? You think the Persians are going to get their hands dirty and get their dresses scuffed by seawater? No, they're going to sit on deck and let the other guys do it. So you can deduce, given that the Persians, the number of crew was not representative to the number of soldiers. And remember, they didn't have their own navy, the Persians. I think we mentioned this in the previous episode, but they relied on the employment of more apt seafaring cities or states, such as the Phoenicians or the Egyptians, because the Persians were a massive empire, but they originated in the desert, not on the sea, right? They weren't coastal. They annexed coastal areas and said, hey, you guys can work for us, right? And it's a pretty sweet deal, right? Hey, I get to keep my territory, and all I got to do is do what I was doing before, but with some Persian guys around me, right? Cool, right? I'm down. So a Persian trireme crew would be manned by the typical 170 oarsmen and 16 Persian marines. But Herodotus in his histories claims that the Persian navy had increased the number of marines by 30 for the Greco Persian Wars. And part of the reason for this could be maybe given the fact that there was the tension after the Ionian revolt, and people saw the burning of Sardis, so maybe the Carthaginians or the Egyptians. And the Egyptians love to revolt against the Persians, but maybe these people would have been more, I guess, readily mutinous, right? So these crews, the Carthaginians and the Egyptians, might have said, hey, you know what, like, Greeks are fighting you guys, we'll go back them up. So they actually, they loaded the ships with more soldiers to prevent this from occurring, right? So at this point, we would have about 46 Marines per ship on top of the 170 oarsmen. So when you multiply this figure out by 600, 46 by 600, you get a roughly 27,600 fighting men. And of that 27,600, 26,000 were infantry and another 1,000 to 2,000 were cavalry. And this brings us as close as we can to a reasonable figure. And that's quite a bit considering what the Greeks had or the Athenians had to fight the Persians. But let's bear in mind, let's pump the brakes and bear in mind that this force heading towards Athens was only an expeditionary force. This was not the entire might of Persia. This was a tugboat and a couple of dudes like, hey, go over there and just like smack these guys around a little bit. So had Darius sent the entirety of their military might, we'd all be, we wouldn't be speaking Persian right now, but the outcome of the Western world very well may have looked a lot different, right? So now that we know the forces and we know the intent of the Persians, remember the Athenians and hey, Zeus, let me strike these guys down. Let's trace their path to Athens. And spoiler, it's not a direct path and the Persians are in no hurry.
Yeah, I mean, also, just to bring everyone back to reality as well, like 27,000 people is a metric crap ton of people. That's a lot of guys. That's a massive military, especially for 490 BC. 600,000 is like, that's an ungodly amount of people. 600,000, if they'd actually got that many people together, the entire Greek world together wouldn't have stood a chance against that. So 27,000 is still a massive military.
The population of Attica, like the peninsula that Athens was on, and I think maybe even Evia, it's weird. It looks like Euboea, but it's actually pronounced Evia, where Eritrea was on. I'm not sure if that was included, but I know with Attica, the entire population, not just fighting men, was only 300,000, right? So, and bear in mind, the reason why some of these historians might have such drastically large numbers is because, look at that, 46 fighting men per ship per 170 oarsmen, right? So those oarsmen were still present. They might have been non-combatants, though, right? So there was still a ton of people, but those guys were all off at the distance on the horizon on their boats, right? So it's easy to see how Herodotus, to give him, to throw him a bone a little bit, to give him the benefit of the doubt here. It's easy to see how those numbers would be conflated, but yeah, I don't even think that many men would fit on the plain of Marathon.
No, they wouldn't. And we could be wrong, and that number is up to interpretation. But for the rest of the podcast, know that we're going to be assuming that there was roughly 26 to 30,000 Persians that were doing this expedition, right? And the reason they amassed such a massive force is because, Darius, sure, his end goal was Athens, but he definitely had some plans along the way for the Aegean. And this expedition, while they're headed for Athens, they're not exactly in a hurry to get there. They've got a lot of other stops they want to make on the way. And Darius, being the bookkeeper, being very efficient, he decides to do it all at once. He's not going to do 5 different expeditions. He's going to amass one expedition, try to get as much done as he possibly can, especially because of how difficult it is at any time during history to amass large expeditions, And like Ashton was saying, this navy is not necessarily his, right? It's more of a contract navy. So he doesn't want to have to get them all together, send them back to their home, get them all together again. So he decides to appoint Datis and Artaphernes II as the commander of his forces, and Hippias, the previous tyrant of Athens, was also present. So this was likely in an advisory role to the Persians, just because Hippias had, a lot of experience dealing with the Athenians. And Artaphernes, by the way, this is Artaphernes II. So if you listen to the last episode, this is actually that Artaphernes' son. But they have the exact same role, right? They're both the satrap of Lydia. And realistically, as far as history goes, this Artaphernes is not much different than his father, as far as what we know. So it is a different guy, but they're the same role, and it's just his son.
Yes, sir. Datis, we don't know a lot about these two guys. They were, the stories mainly focused on the home team, the Greeks, right, the Athenians. Datis was an important Persian general, or Achaemenid, same thing. It's not written explicitly, but it's suspected that he was present during the 494 defeat of the Greek forces at the Battle of Lade, which was the battle that ended the revolution. So being this guy, maybe he was the one in command of it, right? And so, Darius would be like, hey, you put down this revolt, now I want you to see this through, right? You're heading, and he was the primary commander, right? Artaphernes II was his secondary commander. And Riley pretty much summed up all we know about Artaphernes. All we know is he was present during the 492 mishaps in Greece, where those ships sunk, and he was later alongside Xerxes in the 480 BC invasion of Greece. So, upon embarking, the Persians would island hop across the Aegean, destroying or annexing all who stood in their way. So, tell me something that's more Persian than that. Going and beating one guy up and be like another guy, like, hey man, you're cool. Give me some knuckles. Right? Their first stop would be Rhodes, and here they sought to capture the city Lindos, but a chronicle found within a temple suggests that the Greeks repelled Datis and the city survived. So right off the bat, they're like, we just took an L and we just set off, right? So maybe you could imagine they might be a little shaken, but no, not the Persians, right? Next, they would arrive in Naxos. Yes, that Naxos, the one that Aristogoras failed to take in 499, so likely they were seeking retribution, and it was a wealthy island, so they probably just wanted it anyway. And the Persians would soon conquer the city, sending the citizens fleeing up into the mountains, and they left shortly thereafter, but they burned it in the temples to the ground, so they basically eliminated Naxos from the picture for 40, 30 years. The next stop would be the Cyclades, which was a group of islands southeast of Athens in the middle of the Aegean. Here, Datis would proceed upon the city of Delos. Unlike Naxos, the Persians chose clemency here. Like I said, knuckles, right? They had made up an example of the Naxians, right? So they already burned those guys to the ground. So what good would it be to further alienate their soon-to-be subjects? Because that's what the Persians thought going into this. They're like, all of these guys will be under heel in a year, right? Why are we gonna stir the pot and cause more anger for a revolt? Let's just take care of them.
To dive in really quick, when we talk about Naxos, it's really funny because in some historical contexts, they'll say that the Persians seeking retribution against Naxos, like they're personally offended that Naxos defended themselves. It's pretty hilarious. The Persians are like, the audacity of you to defend your own city from us conquering it, we will now burn you to the ground. But like I talked about in the last episode, this is exactly what the Persians do. The reason that their ultimatums hold such weight is because they actually will do what they say they're going to do. Like their ultimatum it's not like, hey, do this or we'll attack you. And then when you don't do it, they don't attack you. It's very much so, do this or we're going to attack you. And then they will attack you. And then they're going to attack you again. And then in the case of Naxos, they're going to attack you a third time. And the third time, they're going to have this massive grudge and just burn your city to the ground. But, as far as I'm aware, I'm not sure if, with Delos, did they even fight at Delos?
No, they did not.
There you go.
Delos, the birthplace, it was suspected, in Greek mythology, this was the birthplace of Apollo, obviously an important god for the Greeks. And reportedly, Datis would go to burn 300 talents of frankincense in respect to the Greek god. And some speculation as to why he did this are as follows. To earn the favor of the oracle of is it Delhi or Delphi? I think it's Delhi, right?
I think it's Delphi, but I'm not sure.
Oh, okay.
I have no idea.
Earn the favor of the oracle of Delphi for Persia, to appear friendly to the local denizens, like we said, they thought they were just going to be their subjects soon, or because the Persian god Ahura Mazda was similar to Apollo. We can't know for sure, but let's take a look at it from Datus' words, and this is a quote. "Holy men, why have you fled away and so misjudged my intent? It is my own desire and the king's command to me to do no harm to the land where the two gods were born, neither to the land itself nor to its inhabitants. So return now to your homes and dwell on your island."
So, no, I just wanted to say, this is a great example of what we've been talking about over and over again. The Persians, they're actually not horrible rulers if you are willing to let them rule you, and that's exactly what they're trying to do. They've made an example of the Naxians. They don't need to make another example. It's not like they have this personal vendetta to destroy cities that haven't really done much to them. So it's definitely a different lens to look at the Persian Empire through than the, Western Hollywood lens of this like big evil bad guy.
The entire time going through this episode, I keep thinking of 300. The way they portray it, like the dark tones and the Persian immortals and this giant line of men and Xerxes sitting there on his gold throne, just like it being a total just a total asshat,
I know, right? It's so, and it's you if you're listening to this, and obviously if you are, you're probably into history, and we know that like that movie is obviously hyperbole and it's ridiculous, but everyone's seen the movie, so it's still relevant to point out. And even though that movie is clearly not a factual movie, it still influences the people's idea of what Persia was, right? And that's a great example of an incredibly Western and Greek view of Persia at the time. This like mythical force of destruction coming your way, these faceless enemies. But that's not really what's happening. They're very much so an intricate, detailed, and organized group of people, right?
That's an important word, organized, right? Because that's kind of what they strive for with the satraps and all of that. Like they wanted, like with empire, it's not always just conflict and rampage. A lot of it is like, we want to settle this down and we want to implement systems. We want to have governance. We just want your taxes, bro. You guys can do whatever you want to do. Don't revolt, pay us. We're good, right? I can't help but think like you said, how it's such historical hyperbole. And just the thought came to my head and it made me almost start laughing. Of like all the frat boys, like what I know now about the Spartans, like all the frat boys and all those dudes that dress up as Spartans, like, yeah, bro, we're warriors. It's like, are you sure about that? Is there a full moon? Are you in a religious festival? Because if either of those two things are occurring, you're not a warrior.
You're nowhere to be seen.
Yeah, exactly.
In fact, in all of the most relevant battles against Persia, you showed up to one and lost it. The Athenians are really who we should be idealizing if we're going to idealize someone, right? It's just so silly.
Like they show up afterwards and they're like, bro, you guys did this? Seriously? Like they're all like hungover and like...
I don't know, man. That party was crazy.
Yeah, exactly, right?
Yeah, I think it's hilarious.
They're like the this is Riley and I's bias right here, but they're like the chest bumping like football players. They're like, yeah, bro, we're gangster, we're tough, right? And the Athenians are like the dudes quietly like training jujitsu and Muay Thai like 8 hours a day. Right?
Yeah, that would wreck them.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I think that it's we're obviously just having a laugh here, but it's definitely, the Battle of Marathon is for all time. I did a project on it when I was in grade 6, and ever since I've been obsessed with the Battle of Marathon because I find it so much more badass than Thermopylae or other battles. I don't know, this battle is so unbelievably incredible. And that's why I've been like excited to do this podcast for so long, which is why I hope, if you're listening, hang on, because it's going to get so intense as we move through into the battle, right?
This episode, believe it or not, when we first started, there was 1 or 2 episodes that we wanted to start with, and one was the Culper Ring or the Battle of Marathon. And we both decided that we wanted to do this one justice, and we had to get some reps under our belt. And that's why this one's the 8th or 9th episode that we've released, is because we really wanted to figure out how we could deliver it in a satisfactory way. Because as Riley said, it is just such a badass story.
It's epic. So yeah. I'm going to dive back in because 100%. Right now, Delos has been captured. And from this victory, the Persian fleet now, they would set sail to Evia, which is sort of spelled Euboea, but it's pronounced Evia, which is the home of Eretria. And they land at the southern tip at Charistos. Now, just something to note, Evia is, right now in modern time, there are 2 bridges from Evia to Athens, right? To the Athenian peninsula, right? It's unbelievably close. They're right at the homes. Like they're pretty much in Athens right now, but they are separated by a very thin little bit of water, and it's just enough. But I mean, by no means are they not in the Athenian homeland right now. I think that this is as close to the Athenian homeland without being in the Athenian homeland as they can be. So at this point during their island hopping expedition, the Persians were able to obtain hostages from each Greek city that they had captured. And this was sort of a safeguard against revolt, right? I've got your kids. I will kill them if you try to revolt. And Charistos, however, they refused to present hostages. And the Persians would siege the city and destroy the land until they had submitted. And this didn't take long. So this is, right now the Persians, they've taken a couple cities along the way, and they're getting about a good deal of resistance, right? So it's definitely relevant.
100%. As Riley just alluded to, Evia was right across, right? It was 100 kilometers from Athens, and they were headed there. But before they could, they had some unfinished business with Eritrea. You remember those 5 triremes that they sent 9 years ago in the Ionian Revolt? Because Darius does. He remembers. He remembers those 5 specifically. Actually, he's like, those guys. Hey, you guys remember those? I remember those.
Those 500 guys.
Yeah, exactly right. So the Persians had reached Eritrea. We're going to just pronounce it differently. It's the same thing. In an unfortunate turn for the Greeks, the Eritrean nobles were divided. And, throughout history, you see this. Usually when people are fence sitting, there's either like one of two things that occur. Is you have a larger than life figure that makes the difference. It's foreshadowing, pay attention. Or you lose, right? And in the case of the Eritreans, they lost. So they cannot come to a consensus on what the right course of action would be: to fight, to capitulate, to attempt to withstand the siege. And with the Persians bearing down, and by no decision made, by default they became under siege. And for the Persians, having no or minimal siege equipment, they utilized violence of action. So they had attacked the walls viciously, and many men fell, Persian and Eritrean alike. And this lasted for 6 days, whereupon the 7th day, 2 prominent pro-Persian noblemen inside the city had opened the gates. Eritrea would fall and be razed, which was, in the eyes of the Persians, revenge for Sardis, right? Because Eritrea wasn't a backwater city like Naxos or Lindos. Like this was a big city, right? Eritrea was a sister city to Athens, right? So pretty important in this region. But now it was ashes, right? Its populace would be taken hostage, and again, this actually speaks very highly of Darius, because the population of this city was taken hostage and moved. They were relocated to Iran in a city called Susa. And actually, a fun little fact here I came when I was doing my research: Alexander the Great, in his foray into Persia, 160 years later, actually came across these Greeks in Susa. Not the same people. It's not like they were suddenly immortal, right? but like the descendants of these people that Darius had relocated, he could have just slaughtered them, right? Like, hey, you attacked us. He could have just ended them. But instead, he's like, hey, you know what? You guys are troublemakers. I'm not going to kill you all. You can come in my empire, right? You guys can come over here and do this, right? And that's exactly what happened. So that's just a little fun fact for you guys. And so Eritrea fell. But in the days leading up to the assault, the Eritreans had actually appealed to the Athenians for aid, and they had responded. They ordered 4,000 of their settled citizens in nearby Chalkis to take up arms and aid in the fortification of the city. However, upon reaching Eritrea, the Athenians were warned by an Eritrean nobleman that the leadership within the city had yet to derive a decisive plan, and that they'd best flee and spare their lives.
So I think that this is an interesting sort of note about how Greeks were doing business at the time. Ashton said pro-Persian noblemen. I doubt that these guys were actually pro-Persian. It's just that they were obviously very self-serving noblemen, right?
Opportunistic's probably a better word.
There you go, right? So they're opportunistic. It's not like they're not aware that by opening the gates of the city, their people are going to get obliterated, and it's not that they're aware that within the next couple of days, they're going to lose anyways. So they're taking this as an opportunity to be like, hey, Persian guys, I'll help you out if you don't murder me, or if you establish me as the leader of this new colony wherever they're going to send people. And then they sort of take that opportunity to, and like Ashton said, like half the nobles, they were divided as to what to do. A lot of them didn't want to fight. And then indecision and inaction led to their inevitable defeat.
That's a. I can see it right now. They all have mugs and T-shirts when they get to Susa. It's like, I opened the gates for the Persian, and all I got was deported.
Yeah, but I will say that I think this one part that is probably not touched on too much is how these 4,000 Athenians that are going to aid Eretria get turned back. I think that that's going to be even like really important later because, you know, knowing what happened to Eretria, it's not hard to speculate what the people of Athens would think if these 4,000 citizens had been killed or captured by Persia. It very well have... You know, it could have swayed the Athenians to capitulate. You know, after all, many within the city were still pro-Persian, whether in actuality or simply to seek an unnamed benefit in the event of conquest. This Athenian noble class, you know, and their quote-unquote democracy, they're actually on the same level of indecision as the Eretrians were at the time. And that's actually really important for later when we talk about the battle and why, you know, there's multiple reasons why the Athenians didn't defend at their walls. And in fact, this indecision is really an important part.
100% it was. And so with the initial task complete by, of the Persians, you know, to subjugate the Aegean and solidify Persian holdings, Datis and Artaphernes set their sights on Athens, and in a few short days they would land upon the plains of Marathon. So they, you know, like when you look at it, like when you zoom out a little bit and you look at it on a grander scale, right? The Persians attacked Naxos in 502. They failed. Aristagoras tried to convince them that he could capture Naxos in 499. He failed. Right? 498, the Ionian Revolution started, and now some of the holdings they already previously had in the Aegean had been freed by the Athenians and the Eritreans and by the Ionians, right? So you had this situation brewing where the Persians tried to basically solidify their grasp on the Aegean 12 years prior, 502 AD. They failed. Now they were going to use a Greek to do it. He failed. The Greek feared for his life, so he revolted, and now I'm kind of just repeating myself, but anyway, they came back and now they had succeeded, right? By all intents and purposes, had they walked away from Marathon, this was a win. This was a pure, like, unadulterated win by the Persians, right? They got right to the doorstep of Athens and said, right? Like, don't try anything, right? They captured back all of what they had lost and then some, and they captured an entire population of people that revolted against them, right? They could have just left. And maybe it's myopic, or maybe it's arrogance from their previous victories, or, you know, and you can't blame them given the steam they had rolling. But like I said, they would push forward and they'd land on the plains of Marathon, which would prove to be a pivotal mistake in both the Persian Empire and the history of Greece.
So we assume, and there's two dates that are most talked about for when the Persians are landing at Marathon. So it's either September 1st or 2nd. But it also might have been August 1st or 2nd. But for consistency's sake and for this podcast, we'll go with September 1st. That's when the Persians are landing at the plain of Marathon. And it's a fun fact, Hippias, the former tyrant of Athens, he had a tie to this place. His father, and I'm not even going to attempt that name. Do you want to try that name? Pisistratus had landed there 56 years earlier on his march to become tyrant of Athens. So that's a cool fun fact. And Hippias is here with the Persians. Remember that, right?
So he's an advisor, right? So it's likely that, you know, you could easily see it saying, here, this is the place to land. This is where we assaulted Athens 56 years ago when my father secured the city and became tyrant, right? You could see that. You could see that dialogue going. That's a scene, right? That's a scene in the movie where, you know, they're on the ship looking out the horizon, like, where shall we strike, right? And then Hippias comes up between the two of them and expresses that, and, you know, here they are.
And it's a perfect landing place for this big of a force that close to the city. It's honestly perfect. And I think that Hippias being here he's really the kryptonite to the Athenians, because planning like this and physical landmarks are often the differences in wars, right? You look at Switzerland being able to be neutral during, you know, massive conflicts in Europe because they have these massive geographical locations that protect them. And Marathon is an exposed geographical location. So the Persians, being so interconnected with other Greeks, are able to use this as an advantage, right?
I would say that it would be like the prime place to land had the Athenians not shown resistance, right? Because
even so, it's still a really good place to land, even with the Athenians showing resistance.
100%, right? So maybe like now, like at this point, it's a question of like, is it the is it dumb luck by the Athenians, or was it their will? Was it their haste to get there? Because the Persians could have just pushed a little bit more inland, and then they would have opened up, right? Because the plane they landed on, there was a shore, and like to the left and right of the shore there was hills, right? So there was kind of there was a bit of a bottleneck, a bit of a choke point to get out of this plain. And where do you think the Athenians decided to go? Inevitably. So upon hearing of the landing point, the Athenians began planning, and this was left to the strategoi. And the strategoi were a group of 10 elected Athenian generals, one each from the 10 tribes of Athens. The utilization of this group of generals replaced the use of one singular Palamark, which was a supreme military commander. And I think this is cool. I wanted to include the etymology of Palamark, like the where the word comes from. It's the literal meaning of the word is derived from two separate words: polemos, meaning war, and archon, meaning ruler or leader. So war leader, right? Or war ruler, right? That is just so sick, man. I love it.
That's gangster.
But at this point, like you could see, like with the way with democracy, right? The strategoi were more influential or important to military decision than the Palamark. Prior to 507, the Palamark was the go-to guy, right? For all intents and purposes, he was the commander-in-chief whenever it came to conflict. And he was still important, but in a different fashion, right? So the strategoi had decided that they had to leave that to leave Athens to be sieged was to lose the city, similar to the Erythraeans. So in desperation, they mustered 9,000 Athenian hoplites and set out to face the Persians.
So I wanted to dive in as well to touch on another reason why they're leaving. Like I said, if you look at Eretria, eventually noblemen just opened the gates. And like I said, Athens and their noblemen are in the same boat where they're very undecided. But these generals, these strategoi, they know that if they leave the city, they no longer have to deal with politicians. They no longer have to deal with these noblemen because the noblemen are not coming to the plains of Marathon to get their hands dirty, right? So it's kind of a win-win where if they're sieged, they're going to have to deal with, politics and people wanting to open the gates and, just finish the siege and we're starving, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But if they're out on the plains of battle, it's just warriors. They're going to just be surrounded by warriors, generals, and people that are down to fight. So it's very much so a make it or break it kind of decision to go to the plains of Marathon. It's more than just a strategic location because Athens has walls. Athens has defenses, but it's almost worse to use those defenses due to the people inside the city.
I want to paint a picture here. All right. So imagine you're there and you're in Athens. You're a young man, right? And you're sitting there in the summer heat, right? The post-summer heat, I suppose. It's September, and there's a great meeting at the town square and at the polis, right? And or in the polis, which is city, and you hear Eritrea has fallen, right? Not in a British accent, however Greek sound, right? Eritrea has fallen, blah, blah, blah. They've been taken prisoner by the Persians. They've landed at the plain of Marathon, right? And you're sitting there and there's fear and there's panic, and all of a sudden a council is called, right? And these strategoi, as Riley said, they come together with the Palamark and they circumvent the aristocratic class who simply just want to line their pockets. Nothing's changed really when you compare that to today. But anyway, you're sitting there and you see this, and then maybe a day later they begin marching out. All the men grab their equipment, their bronze armor, their spears, their helmets, and they're marching out of the city. And as you watch them, you feel emboldened. You feel that spirit take you over, right? And you join the fight, right? I can only imagine, right? Like it sounds so Hollywood, but it also, maybe as a bit of a meathead, that thought appeals to me, right? You're going to your certain death, but it's honorable, right? It's noble. You know what I mean?
We can still, as someone who's been in the military, and
it's esprit de corps. Esprit de corps, that's the word, right?
100%, man. You feel that when you're surrounded by guys that are ready to go to war. There is a completely different feeling, and you even look at it in World War I when people were killing themselves because they weren't allowed to go for whatever medical condition or whatever, right? This is something that would have been a very this is a motivated people. The guys that are going to the Battle of Marathon, they're not going there because they have to. They're going there because they're going there to protect what's theirs, their way of life, which is really important to them. And they've just developed democracy not much earlier, right? So they have something to protect.
Yep, and protect they did. It was September 3rd, and the Athenians had reached the battlefield. Led by Miltiades and the other strategoi, they had positioned themselves for a fight. The road towards Athens was blocked, and it would be a week until the battle, and in that time the Athenians sought aid. Phidippides, a trained runner of Athens, was sent on a mission to Sparta in hopes that they may join the lines. But upon his arrival, however, he found that the Spartans were engaged in a religious ceremony and would be unable to fight until the following full moon. And this is actually what allows us to date the events of Marathon to either August 10th or September 12th, 490. And this is what we were talking about earlier with the Spartans. And like, yeah, man, we're warriors, but like, we're not going to come fight the Persians, man.
and that is, we are like, we're poking fun at the Spartans for this, but realistically, at this time period, you know, these religious festivals and
Huge.
beliefs, it would have been super important to the Spartans. You know, realistically, they do leave, but they leave 10 days later, and they show up to the battle late. So for all intents and purposes, the Spartans essentially say no. They say, yes, we'll come, but when we're ready, when we're done our ceremony, which is essentially useless at the time, right? And then it's said that he goes to a couple other cities, but he goes to Plataea, and the Plataeans actually answer the call. And it might have been a seemingly small contribution in comparison to the Athenians, but it was still more than appreciated because it was 1,000 hoplites, which is still a very relevant amount of people. And what's crazy about this is this little blip in the story. It said that this runner ran 240 kilometers in about 2 days.
That's insane.
When I would read that as a kid, or, you know, even before I started seeing what guys like Goggins or like these super marathon runners, ultra marathon runners are doing, I always thought that's completely impossible. But it's actually possible, you know, and sure, they most likely used multiple different runners, and it most likely wasn't just one guy, but it is possible that it was this one guy. And just to, you know, this could be a whole episode on its own, but every year when people set up and run marathons, the distance between Athens and Marathon is roughly 25 miles, which is the distance that people run. You know, people run 26.2 miles, and that was sort of developed later. The exact distance was developed later, but the rough idea of the marathon that people run every single year is because of this battle, is because of the distance between Athens and Marathon. And I think that that's also a good point because it's not very far. That's a 1 day's march. They're right at the doorstep of Athens.
They're close.
And at this point, the strategoi and their de facto leader, Miltiades, they were at odds with and undecided as to what would be the appropriate course of action. The Persians outnumbered them nearly 3-1. As well, they had the superiority of their cavalry at their disposal, a tool which, used correctly, would spell certain doom for the Athenian forces.
Yeah, I'd like to take a brief diversion from you, Riley, because I'm honestly sick of your voice. To give you guys some history on the leader of the Athenian forces, which Riley and I both pronounce differently. Shocker. Miltiades. In 516 BC, he was appointed to lands previously ruled over by his brother Stesagoras. This was in the Chersonese, an area on the northeast coast of the Aegean, modern-day Gallipoli, so South Turkey, I believe. You might be asking why this is significant. Well, if you listen to our previous episode, you'd remember that Darius actually had a campaign in this region in 513 AD against the Scythians. Now, during that campaign, he had incorporated the areas within Thrace as his own, reducing Miltiades from essentially a king to a vassal king. Miltiades would go on to aid the Persians in their campaign against the Scythians, and in 510 AD, he would be suspected of treasonous plotting against the king and would flee his lands. And the plotting was that when they crossed this bridge to go into Scythia, he was like, hey dudes, why don't we just burn this and leave them over there, right? But the other Greeks were afraid of retribution, so they didn't. Anyway, he next appears in 499 AD, the year of the Ionian Revolt. Miltiades... Sorry?
499 BC. Sorry, typo.
Oh, sorry, yes, 499 BC. That's on me. Yeah, all these figures, 513 BC and 499 BC. This was in BC. So he next appears in 499 BC, the year of the Ionian Revolt. And Miltiades had joined the cause and sought to oust the Persians. And, you know, this was likely to return to his own lands, which he did in 496. But during this time, he would capture the islands of Lemnos and Imbros from the Persians, ceding them to Athens, an act that you think would have, earned him favor. However, we are all aware of the fate of the Ionians, and after the failed revolt, Miltiades would set sail to Athens in 492. Upon arriving, he was treated with hostility, a reasonable reaction to a man who had been accustomed to the life of a tyrant. Remember, Athens became a democracy in 507. This was in 492. 15 years later, and you have this guy coming back in who was a prominent and powerful tyrant. You're probably not going to be too friendly to him. Miltiades would be put on trial, but instead of execution, he would successfully defend himself as a champion of the Greeks against the Persian encroachment. As well, he leveraged the fact that he had first-hand experience of the Persian military tactics, a fact which certainly would be of aid in the inevitable clash between the two factions. Along with this, Miltiades is cited as being the man who advised that the Persian delegation of 491, who had asked for earth and water, be executed. Alrighty, back to the action.
I sort of wanted to touch on why he's the leader, though, for a second.
Let's go.
Because, as we talked about before, the polemarchs, Miltiades is not the polemarch, right? And I think that that's an advantage that the Athenians have with having these 10 elected generals, is they're actually able to identify him as the most valuable resource because he's dealt with the Persians before. So even though he's not actually the leader, he's seen as the most valuable person on the strategoi, and he's then sort of identified as the de facto leader, right? As the guy to go to for the information. And it's also important to note that his son would later become an important political figure. So it could be sort of bolstered, like his value could be dramatized. But, you know, for the sake of this podcast, I think that that's sort of the story we're going to go with, that he's the most important member of the strategoi at the time. But he's actually not officially in charge of the military, but that doesn't matter because these guys are operating democratically. They're identifying who's the most valuable. And even though they understand that he's not maybe the supreme leader of the military at the time, he's still definitely the most important part of the operation, right?
Yeah, a handful of, I think it was 4 of the other strategoi were like, hey, this is like, we're going to cede our authority to this guy. He speaks for us, right? And then he took care of them. But anyway, not only were the Athenians at a militaristic disadvantage, they were at risk of revolt and uprising, as we alluded to earlier. Not all Athenians were against Persia, and many sought to gain by facilitating Athens' defeat and delivering it from the empire. Remember, only 17 years at this point removed from totalitarianism, there are still many of the aristocratic class within Athens who may have held more power under tyranny and who wish for its return. So, knowing what we know up to this point, it's apparent that the Athenians would have to make a call. They had a vote: to fight the Persians on open ground, man to man, or to retreat within the walls of Athens and attempt to withstand a siege. It was tied, 5 against, 5-4. Fortunately for our protagonists, there was a way to break the tie. The polemarch, or in this case, a man named Callimachus. You might remember him from our introduction. He was the tiebreaker, the man who had the casting vote. At this point, Miltiades would come to him and plead that he vote in favor of combat, as he viewed this the only way to save the city, and that is exactly what Callimachus did.
So,
Hollywood, bro. This is Hollywood.
It's so gangster. And it's so unbelievable. It just adds to the incredible feat that this battle sort of was. And that's where we're at. Now we're at the Battle of Marathon. Here we are.
The battle.
It's the day of the battle.
Let's get some.
The Greeks have been positioned securely between these 2 hills, blocking off the passage out of the plain that the Persians were upon. And both armies had been here for about 8 days at this point. And
which brings us to September 12th, 490.
Yeah. And so, you know, what spurred the engagement is unknown. But what we do know is essentially the reason that no one attacked up until this point was that neither saw a clear advantage, right? And we have to remember the Athenians have this amazing thing called a shield wall. They have their phalanx, right? They have their spears. They're very good at defending a position. So perhaps the Persians didn't want to instigate. But the longer they wait, the closer the Spartans get. So it's interesting. We don't really know exactly why they waited so long, but we also don't know why they didn't engage right away. But what we do know is that it's the Athenians that engage. And so one of these hypotheses for why the Athenians decide to eventually engage is that the Persians, who were predominantly a missile-dependent military, had been sort of assaulting the Athenian positions. You know, just doing just doing little skirmishes, small assaults, no massive engagements. But this would have been taking away from, 1, Athenian morale, and 2, just the violence of action, right? That initial game to get after these Persians. But the second option, which is probably the real occurrence, and it's personally what I believe is the real occurrence, is that the Athenians had become aware that the Persian cavalry were missing. And this is a factor that's going to prove to be decisive.
And seeing this, our hero, Miltiades, was spurred to action. He would have his men form ranks, but not in the traditional phalanx. They would array in a long line, with men 8 ranks deep on the flanks and only 4 ranks deep in the center. And by ranks, we mean just men, right? So in the line, maybe there's 5 people lined up, now there's 4 back, right? That's 4 ranks. And you have a block of 20 men, or 40 men if it's 8 ranks deep. Anyway, the idea was to beef up the sides of the Athenian forces to prevent a rout from Persian cavalry, were it to show up. The time was nigh, and the battle was upon them. And it appeared that Miltiades was confident, having been quoted saying, "I believe that, provided the gods will give fair play and no favor, we are able to get the best of it in the engagement." However, that is to say nothing of how the average soldier may have felt. But maybe we can piece that together.
Okay, let me break this down for you. Right now, the Athenians are geared up in 70 pounds of armor. In front of them are near to 30,000 Persians. And behind them, their homes, their wives, the future of their children, and of their democracy. Defeat, it's not an option. Surrender, it's off the table. The only move is to win. And the only way to win is to run through the enemy standing in front of them. There is no quit in these men, no amount of discomfort, pain, or death that they're unwilling to endure. To them, this is total war.
The Athenians and Persians were separated by about 1,500 meters, and the march begins. And some people suppose that the Athenians charged the entire 1,500 meters with a Herculean effort and engaged the Persians outright. And while, a cool thing to believe, this is absolutely fallacious, and I think it actually detracts from what really occurred, which was strategic thinking and then that burst of energy. No human would be able to sprint 1.5 kilometers with 70 pounds of kit on in the hot summer heat, surrounded by 10,000 other men, and proceed to fight in hand-to-hand combat. But fortunately for you, we can tell you what most likely happened. The Athenians would march within 200 meters of the Persian lines, called the beaten zone. Persian arrows would be unable to reach them at this distance.
So I think it's also really important to note, as we touched on just before, the Athenians are very missile-based. So their archery is...
The Persians.
The Persians are very missile-based. Their archery is one of the most important factors for them winning the battle. And the phalanx usually moves quite slowly. It usually marches into battle. So this is one of the most vital points of this battle, is this huge gamble to sprint this last 200 meters towards the Persian position. Now, think about it like this. Think about even today when you're driving on a busy highway and there's traffic, how hard it is to sort of stay within formation while moving at speed. That's why the phalanx moves slowly, so you can maintain the position. But the Athenians, they risk it all. They essentially break formation and sprint this last 200 meters to prevent from getting decimated by Persian arrows. And did we go over the formation that the Athenians are in at this time?
Yeah, the 8, like the 4 in the center, 8 ranks deep on the sides. They were just in a long line, essentially.
Yeah, so the Athenians they've widened the normal phalanx to be able to be the same width of their Persian enemies, to prevent from them getting their sides, their flanks taken over.
Which is an incredible gamble because the difference in size, forces, right?
That's what I'm saying. You're talking about a line of guys 4 people deep running at 27,000 Persians. And I was actually thinking about this in the lead up to this podcast this morning. I was thinking that over these 8 days, it's most likely that the Athenian strategoi have developed this plan to incorporate Persian cavalry. And where do cavalry go? Cavalry go on the flanks. So the Athenians have decided to make this gamble based on the assumption that Persian cavalry are going to be on the battlefield. So these flanks that initially would not have been an advantage and would have been sort of a desperate attempt to keep Persian cavalry off them are now this big advantage. Now they have stronger flanks than the Persians do. So it's an incredible gamble. Not only are they breaking their line is half as thick as it normally would be. So at the center, which is one of the most important points of your battle, there's only 4 guys deep. There's only 3 guys behind you if you're the first guy on the battlefield, instead of the normal 8 that you would have trained with, that you would have been ready for. So this is This is an unbelievable gamble that the Athenians have made here.
100%. And they charged. As Riley said, they cleared the 200 meters and they engaged the Persians. The Persians, however, had positioned their strongest units within the center of their lines, where the Athenians had the weakest position. And you could argue this was a stroke of luck for Miltiades and the other strategoi, but most likely this was a strategic move based upon his knowledge of Persian military tactics. The increased numbers on his wings, as Riley had said, would serve the dual purpose of defense against cavalry and, if successful, an envelopment of the enemy. And that is exactly what happened. The Athenian wings succeeded in the decimation of the Persian lines, and the Persian center succeeded in pushing back the Athenians. A Pyrrhic victory in the truest sense. They won, but they spelled their own doom. They were overwhelmed in the center, and the slaughter began. The Athenians won the day, and the Persians were sent fleeing back to their ships, wherein the Athenians would chase them and capture 7 of their vessels. But if you prefer the Herodotus version, here it is. They fought a long time at Marathon. In the center in the line the foreigners prevailed, where the Persians and Sacae were arrayed. The foreigners prevailed there and broke through in pursuit inland, but on each wing the Athenians and Plataeans prevailed. In victory, they let the routed foreigners flee and brought the wings together to fight those who had broken through the center. The Athenians prevailed, then followed the fleeing Persians and struck them down. When they reached the sea, they demanded fire and laid hold of the Persian ships. And when all was said and done, the death tolls were astonishing. 6,400 dead for the Persians, 192 for the Athenians, and only 11 for the Plataeans. Among the dead, there was one strategoi, as well with Callimachus. The word victory does not do justice to what the Athenians had done that day.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy. I think that these death numbers are something that can't be talked about more clearly. You're talking about 200 Greeks to 6,400 Persians. I think that's a testament to, one, the Athenian armor. I think that's something that most people that know history know about, right? Greek armor, they had these massive shields, they had strong greaves, a good helmet. So even though in the center they were physically pushed back, just due to the sheer force of Persian soldiers pressing on their shields, they actually weren't taking many casualties. They might have been taking more injuries and stuff like that, but they were able to hold the center from being broken just due to their strong armor. And that allowed the flanks to envelop the Persians. And then once the Persians are sort of surrounded in this big arc of Greek, Athenian...
A U, kind of an upside down U.
Exactly. Now they're starting to flee. And while they're fleeing, they're still essentially surrounded as they're trying to wade through the water back to their ships. This, in my opinion, is really where the death toll of the Persians starts to skyrocket. It's while they're trying to get away and they're just getting stabbed in the back by Athenians, slaughtered. It's just this massive slaughter zone, essentially. It's a big kill zone for the Greeks at the time, and they really take advantage of it. They just hack down many Persians.
And to take a moment to think about medieval warfare, because again, we did this in the Hun episode, and I want to do it again. Think of how awful and gruesome it was, right? Like nowadays, yeah, like with explosives and weaponry that is just incredible for mass destruction. There's some incredible abhorrent deaths that you might see, but a lot of it you're removed from it because you're at such a distance, right? You're a sniper making a shot from 800 meters. You don't all you do is see the guy fall, right? For these Athenians, they're in the thick of the battle. They are thrusting their spears within the hearts, within the intestines, the guts, the vital organs of their opponents. They're looking into the eyes of these men as they fall, as they breathe their last on this fateful day. It's not simply a matter of glory and honor. There's blood, there's carnage, there's gore. It's absolute destruction. And This makes me think of how humans at the end of the day are still animals, and in that moment I can only assume the bloodlust and the rage that these Athenian soldiers might feel. They feel so emboldened, right? They felt fear, and they're thinking of their wives, of their children, of their homes, of their people, and they're winning, right? And they're chasing down this opponent, and you can only imagine again just the absolute destruction that they wrought upon the Persian forces.
I think it's also crazy to think you're talking about a motivated military versus an unmotivated military. And what I mean by that is the Persian soldiers don't necessarily have as much invested as the Athenians do. Like we touched on, this is everything to these Athenian soldiers. There's no lose situation here. The Persians don't have that. The Persians don't have that same mentality. And also, I was just thinking while you were talking about that, along the way through this expedition, the Persians have been winning. And it said that maybe they lost at Rhodes, but they most likely sort of tried to take over Rhodes, didn't really work out, and then they just were like, whatever, right? Not worth it. But now they've got these Athenians who are just, they're
Barbarians.
there to destroy them. You know what I mean? You're seeing your best friend get smashed in the face by an Athenian shield, and it's just shattering his skull in front of you, and the guy just looks at you, sword covered in blood, and you're next. You know what I mean? This is the thought that the Persians are going through. It's this unbelievable sort of atmosphere. There's something in the air. The Persians have the confidence. They're there to win. That's what I think the biggest difference is. Sorry, the Athenians. The Athenians are there to win. Even just showing that the Persians have their boats sitting there ready to retreat, right? They're ready to pull off this battlefield. Where the hell are the Athenians going? They're going through your face. Violence of action. It's absolutely gangster. And that's what they do. They win.
And as Riley said, the Persians had they had more to lose, they had less to lose and could simply just, hey, we'll just retreat, right? And that's what they did. And after the battle, attempting to salvage a victory from their defeat, Datis and Artaphernes would sail for Athens, as after all, the city was undefended, and inhabited by many who would open the gates for Persian rule. The Athenians then would send a runner to Athens to warn of the impending attack, and supposedly he would run 40 kilometers, or 26 miles, whereupon reaching the city, collapse of exhaustion and die. And the story is likely apocryphal, but nonetheless, as Riley was getting to earlier, this served as the inspiration for the length of marathons people run today. So the Persians would arrive in the port city of Phaleron, 5 kilometers south of Athens, in an attempt to mount a second offensive. However, they were alerted to the fact that the Athenian soldiers were aware and on their way. And after they got smoked by these guys, they're probably shaking in their boots. And they realized that they would not be able to take Athens by surprise. And after their defeat at Marathon, they were unwilling to risk a second battle, and they would withdraw and retreat to Asia. And this would be the last.
There's a couple other stories that we didn't touch on, and these go back to sort of stories, and the two stories that are the most popular in this battle is it's either between the Athenians win this incredible battle and then turn around and march back, and by the time the Persians get to the Athenian gates, they're there, and they're in the Athenian city. They've occupied the defenses already, which would have been unbelievably incredible to think that they can win this battle and then turn around, march with their armor 26 miles and be back. So the other story is that the Athenian population, the people living in the city, dressed up as soldiers, stood on the battlements and pretended that the city was well defended again. And that sort of pushed the Persians away. Do we know exactly what happened? No, we don't know exactly what happened. But those are a couple good stories, and they're possible. It could have happened.
Yeah, very well could have. That's the fun thing, and also the frustrating thing about history is like when you want to tell the cohesive tale, there's so many tangents that we can't really verify, right? But what we can verify is the fact that this would be the last time that Darius I would step to the Greeks, right? This was the last time he would attempt to subjugate Greece. And not to say that this was the last time the Persians would, simply just Darius. Upon news of his defeat, he had plans to amass an even larger force and lead it himself. However, revolts in Egypt postponed his plans indefinitely. He would pass away at the age of 64 in 486 AD, 4 years after Marathon. God, hearing about that probably aged that man like 40 years, man. It's like, what, 6,400? There was 10,000 of them, guys. Seriously. Why didn't you use the Phoenicians, bro?
How many times do we have to try this?
We had 600 boats with 170 rowers, and you left them on the ships.
Where were they? On the boats?
I could just see him sitting there like taking a deep breath.
Art of Ferns, he's just standing there just like his dad did 5 years before him. You know what I mean? We lost again.
Oh, man. But, bro, they had dragons. All right? That's it. Suddenly Game of Thrones. But yeah, that's it for the Battle of Marathon. But we want to take a minute to discuss back to it why it's likely that the Persians lost that day. Aside from the strategic planning and the tenacity of the Greeks, there's also a stylistic difference in their militaries, and that was that the Greeks were melee fighters. They were wrestlers, they were spearmen, they were swordsmen. They preferred to be up close and personal to engage in the strife of hand-to-hand combat. This was their comfort zone, imminent danger, but also within the reach to cause harm to their opponent. They were clad in bronze with large shields and long spears, a kit that undoubtedly aided them against the arrows of the Persians.
The Persians, however, had a more refined military style. You could say they would rely on projectiles far more in tandem with their cavalry. They would hail endless amounts of arrows upon their enemies, blotting out the sun. And when the ranks would break, due to the barrage, the cavalry would pursue the fleeing opponents and cut them down where they stood.
And this is not to say that one is better than the other, rather that the geographic differences in the opponents they may have fought would have led them to opposite styles of warfare. One reliant on projectiles and cavalry, one reliant on grit and tenacity. Both equally effective under the right circumstance. And the Persians, they were armed primarily. They had a short sword on their hip, but primarily they wore light dress and relied on projectiles, archery. So they would have bows and wicker shields, light wicker shields that they could set up a defense against other projectile fire. But that doesn't really do much for you when the Athenians are breaking through your wicker shields and getting after it, and they're not shooting any arrows. So you could see how what they were used to fighting in Egypt and Babylon and against the Scythians would not work against the Athenians, who preferred hand-to-hand combat. And perhaps a quote from Mike Tyson can help sum up the victory of the Athenians over the Persians. And that's, everyone's got a plan until they're punched in the face. And, as we know, the Athenians were really good at punching, so... And I have to say, a bit of further history is that not only was Marathon a fascinating battle, it was a pivotal point in the future of Greece. This would provide Athens with the influence to develop into one of the dominant powers of the Mediterranean. In 478 BC, 12 short years after Marathon, the Greeks would repel Xerxes and end the second invasion of Greece with a victory at the Battle of Plataea. The Athenians would then found the Delian League, assuming a leadership role, essentially an Athenian Empire light. However, conflict would arise within, and as a result lead to the Peloponnesian War. The after effects of this, 100 years later, was a divided Greece, with Athens never again reaching the heights of its previous power. This may have been a catalyst for the eventual rise of Macedon, under Philip II, and eventually the world's greatest conqueror, Alexander the Great. I bring that up only as a notice how history is not, how one event that you might think is isolated 100 years prior could have second, third, fourth, fifth order effects down the road that completely changes the direction of that geographical region or of the world in general. Alexander the Great had amassed such an incredible wealth that he actually, people talk about what's in Mansa Musa, about disrupting economy. That was in Africa. Alexander the Great literally disrupted the economy of the entire known world at that time with the amount of wealth and land he had conquered. It's incredible to think that this may never have came to be if the Athenians hadn't formed the Delian League, or if they had not won the Battle of Marathon, or what would have happened? Because these doors never would have opened for Philip to have become as powerful as he did. And this isn't about Philip or Macedon or Alexander the Great, but simply just to illuminate how incredible history could be at planning the future before anybody can even conceive of it.
Yeah, man, I love this. I love this event in history. As a fan of history, this is one of the stories that I love to go back on, and I hope we did it justice for our listeners, and I hope that, if you didn't know about this conflict, that you learned a bit, and if you did know about it, that maybe you just enjoyed the show and enjoyed the listen, because this was This was one
fun.
that we were excited to talk about.
This
and
was
I think
a really
that
fun episode.
This was my favorite episode so far. I'm happy to end it here. How do you feel?
Yeah, I'm good to go. Before Riley closes us out, I just want to say again, thank you for everybody listening. I'm grateful for all you guys. You've helped us out. We're growing. And I can't wait to inevitably hear from some of you and engage in a discourse, talk to you guys about history, because I'm sure if you're listening, you love it as much as we do. So once again, thank you for listening to the Battle of Marathon, and I hope you all have a wonderful day or evening whenever you listen to this.
Yeah, so I'm going to dive back into a couple ways to support the show. I'm going to do a bit more of a detailed explanation this time. As I touched on earlier, subscribing and giving us a good review are two great ways to help the show, and it helps you stay up to date because we do this every week. We're going to be doing these episodes pretty much every week. Maybe we'll miss one or two, but as best as we can, we'll do them every week. The best way is to go to humanhistoriespodcast.com. Right now we have set up, we've got all the show notes. We decided to put them up on the website because we sort of wanted to make the donations and the Patreon just if you want to. We didn't want to make it so that you miss anything by not donating. We just wanted to make it more of a, if that's what you feel like you want to do, that's awesome. And it helps us with the show. And every donation you make is going to be 100% reinvested back into increasing the quality of the show. And another thing you can do is you can purchase the books that we recommend to read, which are a lot of the books that we get as sources for these episodes. We've linked them as affiliate links. So if you decide to purchase those books, you can do so through the website, and that helps us out a lot. Another thing you can do is you can message us from the contact part of the website, which is an email at questions@humanhistoriespodcast.com. That helps us a lot as well. And we love to hear from you guys. We love to engage in discourse. We love to get information that we missed, because what's so great about this community is there's such a wealth of knowledge that other people have amassed and things that we miss, and we're going to miss stuff all the time. And we're infinitely curious. Another thing you can do is you can follow us on Instagram. And that's a great way to view clips of the upcoming episodes and get an idea if you're just sort of going to hop into episodes that you find interesting. That's a great way to do it.
Riley's also a bit of a narcissist, so you're going to see his face everywhere, just a heads up. So
yeah,
if you want to see,
Ashen's just like really upset.
If you want to see clips of this beautiful man, go to our Instagram and you'll think that he is the only podcaster involved.
And as you know, if you're listening, I'm the only relevant podcaster involved.
This has been Human Histories with Riley Osborne and only Riley Osborne.
Thanks to the Riley Osborne History Show. But yeah, I mean, those are pretty much the best ways to support the show. We've been growing steadily, increasing listeners steadily, and we hope to be able to get it to the point one day where we can invest a lot of time into this show, and you, the community, are the best way for us to do that. I can't thank you guys enough with the amount of support we've already received. We've only been doing this for not even 2 months, and we're getting, hundreds of listens, which is epic to me. And I can't wait till it's thousands. And I just can't believe that people sit down and consume hundreds of hours of us rambling on about history. So I just wanted to thank everyone. I wanted to say that this has been a great episode to me. I wanted to, thank you, Ashton, for crushing this with me, and I hope that we get to keep doing this. Thanks, guys.